Marcus Reed was 39, a black single father who fixed luxury cars in a narrow garage behind a used dealership on the south side of Atlanta. Every morning before sunrise, he packed his daughter Ella's lunch in a faded blue lunchbox, tied her sneakers when the laces fought her little fingers, and drank his coffee black while standing over unpaid bills. His hands were always marked with grease, no matter how hard he scrubbed. His work boots were worn at the edges. His truck coughed twice before starting. But Ella never left for school without hearing the same calm promise from him. "Head up, baby. We don't let the world tell us who we are." By 8, Marcus was under a silver Mercedes with a flashlight between his teeth, listening to the engine like it was speaking a language only tired men understood. People saw the uniform first. The oil rag. The old toolbox with rust along the corners. They rarely saw the man who skipped meals so his daughter could have field trip money, or the father who read bedtime stories with a repair manual open beside him. That Friday, rain tapped against the garage windows, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead when a black SUV rolled into the lot. The kind of vehicle that made everyone stand straighter. Out stepped Charlotte Whitmore, polished, elegant, and impossible to ignore in a cream coat, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression sharp from too many meetings and too little trust. She owned half the dealership chain, and everyone knew it. The manager rushed toward her like the floor had caught fire. Marcus only glanced up, then returned to tightening a bolt. Charlotte's eyes landed on him. On the grease. On the old boots. On Ella's pink backpack sitting beside his toolbox because school had dismissed early. "Is he the one touching my car?" she asked, not quietly enough. The garage went still. Marcus heard it. So did Ella, sitting on a stool with a library book in her lap. The manager swallowed. "He's our best mechanic, ma'am." Charlotte's gaze stayed cold. "I asked for certified service, not guesswork from someone who looks like he came in off the street." Something tightened in Marcus's chest, but his face did not change. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on the rag, and stepped back from the car. "You're welcome to wait for someone else, ma'am," he said. "But your left rear brake line is leaking, and if you drive out in this rain, you may not stop when you need to." She blinked once, as if the calmness bothered her more than anger would have. A younger mechanic smirked near the parts shelf. The manager looked at the floor. Ella looked at her father with quiet worry, waiting to see if the world had finally pushed him hard enough to push back. Marcus only picked up his daughter's lunchbox, moved it away from the drip pan, and covered Charlotte's leather seat with a clean sheet before leaning in to check the dashboard warning light. That small gesture made Charlotte pause. He was protecting the car of a woman who had just insulted him. Not for approval. Not for money. Because that was how he moved through the world. Then a sharp crack sounded near the service bay. One of the older employees slipped on the wet concrete, sending a tray of tools scattering under Charlotte's SUV. Marcus reached him first. He knelt, helped the man sit up, checked his wrist, and quietly told Ella to bring the first aid kit. Charlotte watched from beside the open hood, her phone still glowing in her hand, forgotten. Before we go deeper into what he discovered that day, tell us where you're watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what happened next changed the way everyone looked at him. When Marcus returned to the SUV, he slid beneath the frame with the old toolbox pulled close. Rain blurred the windows. Coffee went cold on the workbench. Charlotte kept watching. Then Ella stepped closer to the toolbox and frowned at a small metal plate inside the lid, half covered by an oil rag. "Daddy," she whispered, "why does that lady's last name match the one on Grandpa's old tag?" Charlotte heard it. Her eyes shifted down. Whitmore. Stamped into the rusted metal. And for the first time all morning, her confidence cracked. The garage stayed quiet after Ella spoke. Too quiet. Rain drummed softly against the metal roof while fluorescent lights flickered overhead, washing everything in pale white. Marcus slid out from beneath the SUV slowly, the old creeper wheels groaning under his weight. Grease streaked one side of his jaw. He looked first at his daughter, then at the toolbox. His expression tightened for the briefest second. Charlotte Whitmore noticed it immediately. Small reactions mattered to people who spent their lives studying weakness. "Ella," Marcus said gently, "go sit by the heater for me, baby." The little girl hesitated. "But Daddy, the name is the same." "I know." His voice stayed calm. "Just give me a minute." She obeyed because she trusted him. Charlotte watched the child walk away with the backpack bouncing softly against her shoulders. Then her attention drifted back to the rusted plate inside the toolbox lid. Whitmore Industrial Supply. The lettering was faded but still visible beneath years of scratches and oil stains. Something about it unsettled her. "Where did you get that toolbox?" she asked. Marcus reached for the rag and covered the plate without hurry. "It belonged to my father." Charlotte folded her arms. "You never mentioned working for Whitmore dealerships before." "I did not say I worked for them." The answer landed strangely between them. Not rude. Not defensive. Just careful. Marcus stood and checked the brake assembly again, giving himself something to focus on besides the weight pressing quietly against old memories. Across the garage, the manager pretended to organize invoices while listening to every word. Marcus could feel it. Years of being underestimated had sharpened that instinct in him. People always listened harder once they sensed there was more to a man than his uniform suggested. Charlotte stepped closer to the SUV, expensive perfume mixing faintly with the smell of rainwater and motor oil. "My grandfather started Whitmore Industrial Supply 50 years ago," she said. "Those toolboxes were custom shop issue. Employees could not buy them." Marcus tightened the bolt with steady hands. "Then I guess somebody gave this one away." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not angry now. Curious. That was new. Something felt wrong. Marcus sensed the shift the same way mechanics sensed a cracked belt before it snapped. Charlotte Whitmore was no longer looking at him like a disposable employee. She was trying to place him somewhere inside a puzzle she did not understand. Then she noticed the careful stitching along the inside handle of the toolbox. Initials. D.R. Her breath slowed. "Your father's name," she said quietly. "What was it?" Marcus wiped his hands again before answering. "Daniel Reed." The reaction in Charlotte's eyes was almost invisible, but it was there. A flicker. A memory surfacing too quickly to hide. She turned slightly toward the rain-streaked windows as if buying herself time. Marcus noticed it. He noticed everything. Ella looked up from the heater across the room, sensing the tension even without understanding it. Charlotte finally faced him again. "I knew a Daniel Reed once." Marcus said nothing. The garage hummed softly around them. Air compressors hissed in the background. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled low across the city skyline. "He worked directly with my grandfather," she continued. "Years ago." Marcus lowered the hood carefully. "A lot of men worked for powerful people back then." The sentence was respectful, but it carried weight underneath it. Charlotte heard that weight. So did the manager pretending not to stare. She studied Marcus differently now. The calm posture. The measured tone. The discipline in the way he avoided saying too much. This was not just another mechanic trying to survive paycheck to paycheck. There was history here. Old history. Buried history. Then Ella walked back over holding Marcus's thermos with both hands. "Daddy," she said softly, "you forgot your coffee again." Marcus took it with a tired smile. "Thank you, baby girl." Charlotte watched the exchange in silence. The gentleness in his voice did something uncomfortable to her chest. Because men who were bitter did not sound like that. Men broken by life did not look at their children with that kind of steady warmth. And suddenly, against her own instincts, she found herself wondering what else she had judged wrong about him. Charlotte Whitmore stayed longer than someone like her normally would. That was the first thing everybody noticed. Usually, owners came in fast, spoke faster, then disappeared behind tinted windows and assistants carrying tablets. But she remained beside the service bay while rain streaked down the glass doors in silver lines. Marcus could feel the mechanics watching from a distance, pretending to stay busy while quietly tracking every glance between them. He ignored it. Men like him survived by ignoring things. Comments. Assumptions. Eyes that measured worth by uniforms and bank accounts. He had learned that lesson young. Daniel Reed taught it to him standing inside another garage decades ago. A man who explains his dignity too much usually loses it, his father used to say. Marcus heard those words now as he tightened the final connection beneath the SUV. Charlotte crossed her arms against the cold air drifting through the open bay. "You never answered my question," she said. Marcus slid the hydraulic jack aside. "I thought I did." "No," her voice softened slightly. "You avoided it." He stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "My father worked wherever somebody would hire a black man with calloused hands and no degree in 1987. Charlotte held his gaze. "Whitmore Industrial paid better than most." "Sometimes." That answer caught her off guard. She was used to certainty from people beneath her. Gratitude. Fear. Defensiveness. Marcus offered none of them. Only restraint. And somehow restraint unsettled her more. Across the garage, Ella sat drawing quietly on the back of an old invoice sheet. She occasionally looked up at her father with the calm trust only children carried naturally. Charlotte noticed the little details now. The extra sandwich wrapped carefully in Marcus's lunch cooler. The tiny pink water bottle clipped beside his toolbox. The way he checked the garage clock every 15 minutes because school pickup mattered more to him than impressing anyone in the room. Something inside her shifted again. Small. Unwelcome. Real. Then the service manager hurried toward them, nervous energy dripping from every step. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "your meeting downtown starts in 40 minutes. Charlotte did not look away from Marcus. "And?" The manager blinked. "Traffic will be bad with the storm." Marcus wiped his hands with the oil rag and stepped toward the SUV window. "Your brakes are fixed, but the front tire pressure is low. You should avoid the interstate if the rain gets heavier." Charlotte stared at him for a second longer than necessary. "You always give advice after people insult you." Marcus shrugged faintly. "I give advice when somebody might end up stranded in weather like this." The answer landed quietly. Too quietly for the effect it had on her. Because she knew men who smiled politely while waiting for opportunities to embarrass others. She knew executives who weaponized kindness like business strategy. But this man was different. Marcus Reed helped people the same way breathing happened. Naturally. Without performance. Without calculation. That realization bothered her more than his father's connection to Whitmore Industrial. Then Ella suddenly stood and walked over holding her drawing against her chest. "Daddy," she whispered, "can I show her?" Marcus looked tired for the first time all afternoon. "Show me what, baby?" Ella turned the paper around shyly. It was a crayon drawing of Marcus standing beside an old garage with a much younger man next to him. Same broad shoulders. Same quiet eyes. Above them, in uneven child handwriting, she had written, "Grandpa Daniel's shop." Charlotte froze. Her attention locked onto the faded sign Ella had copied in the corner of the drawing. Whitmore Fleet Services. Not Industrial Supply. Fleet Services. A division closed almost 20 years ago after a financial scandal most people no longer remembered. Marcus saw the recognition hit her face instantly. He took a slow breath. Something had just changed. And Charlotte knew it too. The rain finally eased just after 5 o'clock, leaving the garage wrapped in that strange gray quiet that comes after a storm. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the roof outside the service bay while mechanics clocked out one by one, throwing quick glances toward Marcus and Charlotte before disappearing into the parking lot. Nobody said much. But tension lingered in the air like heat trapped beneath concrete. Marcus closed the toolbox slowly after Ella handed him the drawing back. The old metal latch clicked shut with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. Charlotte remained still beside the SUV, staring at the faded crayon copy of Whitmore Fleet Services in her mind. She remembered that division. Barely. She had been young when it collapsed. Too young to understand why executives suddenly stopped mentioning certain names around the dinner table. But she remembered hearing one thing clearly from her grandfather years ago. Some good men paid for mistakes they did not make. At the time, she never asked what he meant. Wealthy families survived by burying uncomfortable truths beneath polished floors and charity galas. Marcus lifted Ella's backpack onto his shoulder while locking the toolbox. "We should get moving, baby girl." Ella nodded sleepily. Long afternoons in the garage always wore her out. Charlotte watched him kneel to zip the child's jacket carefully beneath her chin before standing again. That quiet tenderness unsettled her more every minute. Because she had spent years around men who performed kindness only when cameras were nearby. Marcus never performed anything. Then she heard herself ask the question before deciding whether she should. "What happened to your father?" Marcus paused. Not long. But long enough. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled away from the city. "Life happened," he said finally. Charlotte frowned slightly. "That is not an answer." Marcus gave a tired half-smile that did not fully reach his eyes. "Sometimes it is the only one people get." He started gathering Ella's crayons from the workbench. Charlotte noticed how carefully he handled every small thing that belonged to his daughter. Like the world had already taken enough from them. Something inside her tightened unexpectedly. "Did he work for Whitmore until the division closed?" she asked. Marcus slipped the crayons into the backpack one by one before answering. "My father stopped talking about Whitmore a long time before it shut down." That answer stayed with her. There was no bitterness in his tone. That was what made it heavier. A bitter man was easy to understand. Marcus Reed was not. Then the service manager approached nervously again, holding a tablet against his chest. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "your driver called. He is waiting outside." Charlotte barely acknowledged him. Her attention remained fixed on Marcus. "Do you still have anything from your father besides that toolbox?" The question hung between them. Marcus looked toward Ella first. Always Ella. Then back at Charlotte. "A few things. Documents? Maybe." She exhaled slowly, almost frustrated with herself now. "You understand why I am asking?" Marcus met her gaze evenly. "No, ma'am. I understand why you are curious." That landed harder than if he had accused her outright. Charlotte felt it immediately. Because curiosity implied distance. Observation. Not concern. And she suddenly realized Marcus did not trust her enough to believe anything else. Ella tugged lightly on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy, can we still stop for grilled cheese?" Marcus looked down at her and softened instantly. "Yeah, baby. We still can." Charlotte watched the transformation happen in real time. 1 second reserved. The next warm and grounded again. It was the kind of emotional steadiness money could not teach. Marcus picked up the old toolbox with one hand and Ella's backpack with the other. Then he turned toward the exit. "Your SUV should be fine now," he said calmly. "Just avoid hard braking until tomorrow morning." Charlotte opened her mouth to say something else, but stopped herself. Because suddenly she was no longer sure whether she was speaking to a mechanic. Or to the son of a man her family once failed. Marcus reached the garage door before Charlotte noticed something small resting near the edge of the workbench where the drawing had been. An old photograph. Black and white. Half hidden beneath the invoice papers. She stepped closer instinctively. Two men stood beside a service truck smiling at the camera. One of them was clearly Daniel Reed. The other made Charlotte's breath catch in her throat. It was her grandfather. Charlotte stared at the photograph long after Marcus and Ella disappeared through the garage doors. Rainwater shimmered across the pavement outside while headlights stretched through the wet evening like pale ribbons of light. Her grandfather looked younger in the picture. Softer somehow. One arm rested across Daniel Reed's shoulder as they stood beside an old Whitmore fleet truck covered in grease and dust. They were smiling like men who trusted each other completely. Charlotte felt something cold move quietly through her chest. Because she had never seen her grandfather smile like that around executives. The service manager stepped closer carefully. "Miss Whitmore?" She did not answer at first. Her thumb brushed across the edge of the faded photo. "Where did he get this?" The manager swallowed. "Marcus keeps a few old things in the toolbox, ma'am. Mostly family stuff, I think." Charlotte looked toward the garage exit where Marcus had left minutes earlier. "How long has he worked here?" "Almost 4 years. And nobody thought to mention his last name." The manager hesitated too long. That told her enough. "People usually do not ask mechanics many personal questions," he admitted quietly. Charlotte folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket before stepping toward the SUV. The leather seat still carried the clean protective cover Marcus had placed there earlier. She noticed it immediately. Most mechanics ripped those off the second a customer walked away. Marcus had left it perfectly smooth. Another small thing. Another unnecessary kindness. She sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Outside, mechanics laughed faintly in the distance while locking up for the night. But inside the SUV, silence pressed against her thoughts. Daniel Reed. Whitmore Fleet Services. A division erased from company conversations almost 20 years ago. She could still remember fragments from childhood dinners. Lawsuits. Missing records. Angry investors. One employee blamed publicly before the company moved on and rebuilt its image. She had never known the name connected to any of it. Until now. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic. Worse. Quietly wrong. Like a story polished too carefully over the years. Charlotte finally started the engine, but instead of pulling onto the highway toward downtown, she drove the opposite direction. South side streets blurred past beneath streetlights still wet from rain. Small diners glowed warm against dark sidewalks. Corner stores. Laundromats. Bus stops filled with tired people heading home. The kind of places executives rarely saw unless viewed through tinted windows. 20 minutes later, she spotted Marcus's old truck parked outside a narrow sandwich shop squeezed between a pawn store and a dry cleaner. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the glass. She almost kept driving. Almost. Instead, she parked across the street and watched through the window without fully understanding why. Marcus sat in a booth beside Ella, still wearing the oil-stained work shirt from the garage. His toolbox rested near the table like an extension of him. Ella laughed about something with grilled cheese crumbs on her cheeks while Marcus listened with complete attention, even though exhaustion pulled visibly at his shoulders. Charlotte noticed the waitress refill his coffee without asking. He thanked her by name. Not performative. Familiar. Like a man who moved through hard years without becoming hard himself. Then Ella slid the crayon drawing back across the table. Marcus studied it quietly before smiling at the little girl. Charlotte could not hear his words through the glass, but she saw Ella beam afterward like she had just been handed something precious. Belief. Maybe that was it. He knew how to make people feel safe without power. Without money. Without demanding anything back. Charlotte looked down at the photograph again inside her coat pocket. Her grandfather's smile stared back at her beside Daniel Reed. Two men standing shoulder to shoulder before something terrible had clearly happened between their worlds. Then Marcus glanced toward the window unexpectedly. Their eyes nearly met through the rain-streaked glass. Charlotte looked away instinctively, suddenly unsure why she was there at all. But when she looked back a second later, Marcus was still watching the street calmly. Not suspicious. Not angry. Just aware. And somehow that made her pulse rise faster than if he had confronted her outright. Marcus knew the SUV was still across the street long before he looked up and saw it. Men who spent years surviving on too little developed instincts sharper than most people realized. He noticed patterns. Silence. Watching eyes. The slight reflection of headlights sitting too long in one place. But he did not mention it to Ella. She was busy dipping grilled cheese into tomato soup while swinging her sneakers beneath the booth seat. "Daddy," she asked softly, "did I say something bad back there?" Marcus leaned back against the cracked vinyl booth and shook his head. "No, baby girl. You told the truth." "Then why did everybody look weird after?" He smiled faintly at that. Children always noticed emotional weather before adults admitted it existed. Because grown folks spend a lot of time pretending they do not remember things. Ella frowned thoughtfully, trying to understand. Marcus reached over and brushed crumbs gently from her sleeve. "You did nothing wrong." Across the street, Charlotte sat motionless behind the wheel while condensation blurred the edges of the windshield. She should have left 20 minutes ago. Her assistant had already called twice about the downtown meeting she missed. Investors were waiting. Executives were probably irritated. Normally that mattered to her. Tonight it felt strangely distant. Because every answer she uncovered about Marcus Reed only seemed to open another question beneath it. Then her phone buzzed again. This time it was her grandfather. Charlotte stared at the screen for a second before answering. "You skipped the meeting," the older man said without greeting. His voice carried the rough steadiness of age and authority. "That is unlike you." Charlotte looked through the diner window toward Marcus and Ella. "Do you remember a man named Daniel Reed?" Silence. Not long. But enough. Her grandfather exhaled slowly on the other end. "Where did you hear that name?" Charlotte straightened slightly. "So you do remember him?" Another pause. He sounded older suddenly. "Charlotte. I found a photograph." The line went quiet again except for faint static. Then his voice lowered carefully. "You should let old things stay buried." That answer chilled her more than anger would have. Charlotte watched Marcus laugh softly at something Ella whispered across the table. Such an ordinary moment. Such a peaceful one. Yet somehow connected to a name powerful people still reacted to decades later. "Did Whitmore Fleet Services fire him?" she asked quietly. "It was complicated." "That is not an answer either." Her grandfather sighed heavily now. "Daniel Reed was a good mechanic." Was. Charlotte noticed the past tense immediately. What happened to him? People made decisions. The answer frustrated her instantly. Corporate language. Vague. Careful. Designed to avoid guilt. She hated hearing it from herself. Somehow it sounded worse coming from family. "Did we ruin his life?" she asked. Her grandfather did not answer right away. Instead he said something that stayed with her long after the call ended. Sometimes companies survive because one man refuses to destroy them. Even when they deserve it. Then the line disconnected. Charlotte lowered the phone slowly. Her pulse had changed. She could feel it. Something bigger sat underneath this story. Something unfinished. Inside the diner, Marcus glanced toward the SUV again. This time Charlotte did not look away quickly enough. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass for one brief second. Marcus stood calmly from the booth and grabbed Ella's jacket. "Come on, baby," he said gently. "We should head home." Ella yawned and reached for his hand automatically. Charlotte watched him help the little girl into the old truck with patient movements worn smooth by years of fatherhood. No rushing. No frustration. Just quiet care. Then Marcus paused before climbing into the driver's seat. He looked directly across the street at Charlotte one final time. Not accusing. Not intimidated. Just aware. As if he understood she was standing near truths her world had hidden for a very long time. Then his truck engine rumbled to life beneath the soft Georgia rain, and Charlotte found herself following him without fully deciding to. Marcus noticed the headlights behind him 3 blocks after leaving the diner. Same distance. Same careful turns. The black SUV stayed far enough back to avoid looking obvious, but close enough that he understood exactly who was driving it. He rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel while old jazz crackled softly through the truck radio. Ella had already fallen asleep against the window with her backpack clutched in her lap. Atlanta drifted past outside in wet reflections and tired streetlights. Marcus could have driven faster. Could have turned down another road. Instead, he stayed calm. Because fear and curiosity looked almost identical from a distance, and Charlotte Whitmore no longer seemed dangerous to him. Just lost inside questions she was not prepared to answer yet. 20 minutes later, Marcus pulled into a narrow apartment complex tucked beside an aging brick church. The building was modest but clean. Flower pots sat outside several doors despite the rain. Someone had painted the stair railings recently. People here took care of what little they had. Charlotte parked across the lot beneath a flickering security light and watched Marcus climb from the truck carefully so he would not wake Ella too quickly. But the little girl stirred anyway. "We home?" she mumbled sleepily. "Yeah, baby." Marcus smiled softly. "You want me to carry you?" Ella nodded without opening her eyes fully. Marcus lifted her into his arms with practiced ease while balancing the old toolbox in his other hand. Charlotte watched him move toward the apartment stairs beneath the pale yellow lights. No audience. No performance. Just a father carrying his entire world against his shoulder. Something tightened painfully inside her chest before she understood why. Her own father had never carried her anywhere. Not emotionally. Not physically. Wealth had provided drivers, schools, security, private tutors. Everything except warmth. Marcus disappeared upstairs while Charlotte remained motionless behind the wheel. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield again. She should leave. Instead, she found herself staring at the apartment windows until a soft glow appeared on the second floor. Through partially open blinds, she caught small glimpses of ordinary life. Marcus helping Ella out of her shoes near the couch. A tiny kitchen light switching on. Steam rising from what looked like canned soup reheated late at night. Quiet movements. Quiet survival. Then she noticed something else. Marcus paused beside a shelf near the kitchen and rested his hand briefly against a framed photograph before continuing. The gesture lasted barely 2 seconds. But it carried the kind of grief people learn to hide so deeply it became muscle memory. Charlotte looked away instinctively. She suddenly felt like an intruder watching something sacred. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her assistant texting reminders about tomorrow's board presentation. Charlotte ignored it. Instead, she stared up at Marcus's apartment window while memories kept circling louder in her mind. Some good men paid for mistakes they did not make. Her grandfather's voice would not leave her alone now. Then movement inside the apartment caught her attention again. Marcus stepped onto the narrow balcony wearing a gray thermal shirt, coffee mug in one hand despite the late hour. He looked tired. Deeply tired. But not defeated. The city lights reflected softly across his face while rain mist drifted through the parking lot below. For a long moment he simply stood there in silence. Thinking about bills perhaps. Or his daughter. Or the woman sitting unseen in a luxury SUV watching his life from a distance she did not know how to cross. Then Marcus looked directly toward her vehicle again. This time there was no uncertainty in it. He knew she was there. Charlotte expected frustration. Suspicion. Instead, Marcus lifted the coffee mug slightly toward the windshield. A quiet acknowledgement. Nothing more. The gesture stunned her more than anger would have. Because after everything today, after the judgment in the garage, after the questions digging into old wounds, this man still chose grace over humiliation. Charlotte felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. And for the first time in years, the powerful woman who controlled thousands of employees sat alone in her expensive SUV feeling very small. Charlotte barely slept that night. The city skyline outside her penthouse windows glowed silver beneath low clouds while untouched documents covered her dining table. Acquisition reports. Investor summaries. Legal drafts waiting for signatures. Normally she moved through work with ruthless clarity. Tonight her thoughts kept returning to a tired black mechanic standing on a narrow apartment balcony holding coffee in one hand like dignity itself weighed nothing at all. Around 2 a.m, she finally walked into her private study and unlocked a cabinet she rarely opened anymore. Old company archives sat inside in neat leather boxes inherited after her grandfather retired. Most of it was ceremonial history. Expansion deals. Awards. Public relations photographs. Carefully polished versions of the past. Charlotte pulled out the oldest Whitmore Fleet Services folder she could find and carried it to the desk. Dust clung faintly to the corners. Her grandfather's handwriting appeared across several tabs. For the next hour, silence filled the room except for paper turning slowly beneath the warm desk lamp. Then she found the name. Daniel Reed. Senior Mechanical Supervisor. Commended for operational excellence 3 consecutive years. Charlotte sat straighter immediately. There was even a photograph attached to one report. Younger. Smiling. Same steady eyes Marcus carried now. Her pulse slowed strangely as she kept reading. Then the file changed tone. Internal investigation. Missing inventory. Financial discrepancies. Department restructuring. Daniel Reed's name appeared again beneath another line. Employment terminated pending inquiry. Charlotte frowned. Something about it felt incomplete. Too clean. Too brief. There were no signed statements attached. No testimony. No evidence beyond summary pages typed by corporate attorneys decades ago. The deeper she looked, the more polished the gaps became. And polished gaps usually meant somebody important had buried something ugly. Then she noticed one handwritten note clipped near the back of the file. Refused settlement agreement. Said quote, "I will not lie to save men richer than me." Charlotte stared at the sentence for a long time. Her grandfather's signature sat beneath it. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Because suddenly Marcus's calm restraint made perfect sense. Some forms of dignity traveled through bloodlines. Morning arrived gray and cold over Atlanta. By 7:30, Charlotte was already back at the dealership wearing a charcoal coat over a cream blouse, her hair tied back tighter than usual. Employees straightened the moment she walked in. Rumors had clearly spread overnight. The manager hurried toward her nervously carrying a tablet. "Miss Whitmore, if this is about yesterday, I assure you Marcus is one of our hardest workers." Charlotte looked past him toward the empty service bay. "Where is he?" "He usually comes in around 8. She checked the clock. 7:58. Right on time, Marcus's old truck rolled slowly into the lot beneath the pale morning sky. Ella sat beside him eating something from a paper bag while soft music drifted faintly through the cracked window. Marcus stepped out wearing the same worn boots, same oil-stained jacket, same quiet composure. He noticed Charlotte immediately. Of course he did. But unlike everyone else around her, he did not rush. Did not stiffen. Did not pretend. He simply walked Ella to the office break room first so she could finish breakfast safely before starting his shift. Charlotte watched the small routine carefully. "Homework in your backpack?" Marcus asked gently. Ella nodded with her mouth half full. "Lunch money?" "In the side pocket." He smiled faintly. "That is my girl." Only after making sure everything around his daughter was settled did Marcus finally turn toward Charlotte. "Morning, ma'am." Calm. Respectful. Guarded. Charlotte held the old file folder against her side for a second before speaking. "We need to talk." Marcus glanced once toward the break room window where Ella sat coloring quietly at the table. Then back at Charlotte. "About my father?" The directness caught her off guard. "You knew I would look." Marcus grabbed the old toolbox from his truck bed without breaking eye contact. "People with power usually do." The sentence was not bitter. Somehow that made it heavier. Charlotte took a slow breath. "I think your father was blamed for something he did not do." Marcus's expression barely changed. But his hand tightened once against the toolbox handle. Small. Almost invisible. Then he said something that stopped her cold right there beside the service bay. "My father already knew that before he died." The garage suddenly felt smaller after Marcus said it. "My father already knew that before he died." Charlotte stood motionless beside the service bay while morning light spilled pale across the concrete floor. Air compressors hummed in the background. A mechanic dropped a wrench somewhere near the tire rack, but even that distant noise seemed muted now. Marcus did not say the words with anger. That was what stayed with her. No accusation. No dramatic bitterness. Just truth carried too long by someone tired of explaining pain to people who would never fully inherit it. Charlotte tightened her grip on the file folder. Then why keep the photographs? The toolbox? Why stay connected to any of it? Marcus set the old toolbox carefully beside his station before answering. "Because my father spent his whole life building things with those hands." He glanced down briefly at the grease still worked into his knuckles. "I am not throwing his life away because somebody richer wrote a different story." The sentence settled heavily between them. Charlotte looked toward the break room window again where Ella sat swinging her feet beneath the chair while coloring quietly with crayons. The child looked safe here because Marcus made the world safer around her. Suddenly Charlotte understood something uncomfortable. Marcus Reed had spent years carrying dignity through spaces designed to strip it away piece by piece. And somehow he had done it without poisoning the softness inside him. That realization shook her more than the company records. "Did your father ever try to fight the accusations?" she asked quietly. Marcus gave a faint humorless smile. "You ever try fighting people who own the lawyers, the newspapers, and the bank holding your mortgage?" Charlotte lowered her eyes for a second. "Fair enough." Marcus noticed it immediately. "I am not saying your family invented everything," he added calmly. "But powerful people usually survive scandals better than working men do." The honesty in his voice carried no cruelty. Somehow that made it worse. Charlotte opened the file slowly. There was a settlement offer. Marcus nodded once like he already knew. He refused it. Why? Marcus looked toward Ella again before answering. Because they wanted him to sign papers admitting fault. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. And he would not lie. "No ma'am." Marcus reached for a clean rag and began wiping down tools with slow practiced movements. "My father used to say a poor man only owns two things when life gets hard. His name and the way his child remembers him." Charlotte could not speak immediately after that. Something about hearing those words inside a noisy garage instead of a boardroom made them impossible to dismiss. Then the service manager hurried over nervously carrying a clipboard. "Marcus, customer waiting on Bay 3. Marcus nodded. "Work first. Always work first. I will be there in a minute." The manager glanced awkwardly between him and Charlotte before leaving quickly. Marcus grabbed another wrench from the toolbox. Charlotte noticed how old the metal looked. Used for decades. Maintained carefully. Like the man holding it. "There is more in the archives," she admitted quietly. "Missing reports. Gaps in the investigation." Marcus did not look surprised. "My father kept saying records disappeared." Charlotte studied him closely now. "Did he leave anything behind? Documents maybe?" Marcus paused again. "Longer this time. Maybe. You do not trust me enough to answer." Marcus met her eyes steadily. "You walked into this garage yesterday thinking I did not belong near your car." The words hit harder because they were true. Charlotte felt heat rise faintly into her face. Marcus continued working calmly beneath the fluorescent lights. "Trust takes longer than curiosity, ma'am." For the first time in years, Charlotte Whitmore had no polished response ready. She only stood there listening to the sound of tools against metal while a black single father returned quietly to work despite carrying wounds connected to her family's name. Then Ella suddenly ran from the break room holding a folded piece of paper. "Daddy," she said breathlessly, "I found this inside Grandpa's old Bible last night." Marcus frowned slightly as she handed it over. The moment he unfolded the yellowed paper, the calm expression finally cracked across his face. Marcus stared at the yellowed paper in his hands while the garage noise faded somewhere behind him. For one brief moment, Charlotte saw something she had not seen from him before. Not anger. Not fear. Grief. Deep and sudden. Ella shifted uneasily beside him. "Did I do something wrong, Daddy?" Marcus folded the paper carefully before answering. "No, baby girl." His voice stayed gentle, but lower now. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Inside Grandpa Daniel's Bible. The brown one in the closet." Marcus nodded once. Slow. Thoughtful. Like his mind had traveled years backward without warning. Charlotte tried not to stare, but she noticed the trembling in the edges of the paper before Marcus steadied it again with both hands. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked at her for a long second before deciding something internally. Then he handed her the page. It was not a legal document. Not exactly. It looked handwritten. Faded ink. Creases worn deep with age. Charlotte recognized her grandfather's signature immediately near the bottom. Her breath caught. The note was short. "Daniel, if anything happens with the board, do not sign those papers. I know who moved the inventory. I will fix this before they bury you with it. Harold Whitmore." Charlotte read it twice. Then a third time slower. The air inside the garage suddenly felt heavier than oil and engine smoke. "This is real," she whispered almost to herself. Marcus wiped his hands slowly with the rag hanging from his pocket. "My father kept that hidden for 20 years. Charlotte looked back at the signature again. Harold Whitmore. Her grandfather's handwriting. Her grandfather admitting Daniel Reed had been set up before the company publicly blamed him anyway. Marcus reached for the letter again carefully, almost protectively. He never showed it to lawyers. "Why not?" Charlotte asked. Marcus looked toward Ella instinctively before lowering his voice. "Because by then my father was already broke, blacklisted, and exhausted." The honesty in his tone cut deeper than accusation. Charlotte understood that now. There came a point where some people stopped fighting because survival itself consumed every ounce of strength they had left. She watched Marcus fold the letter with precise movements and slip it back into his jacket pocket near his heart. Not for leverage. Not for revenge. Like something sacred. Did your grandfather ever try to contact him again? Marcus asked quietly. Charlotte hesitated. I do not know. But he knew the truth. Apparently. Marcus gave a faint nod at that. Not satisfaction. Just confirmation of something he had already carried silently for years. Then the service manager rushed over again looking panicked. Marcus, customer on Bay 3 is complaining about wait times. Marcus closed the toolbox gently. I will handle it. The manager glanced nervously at Charlotte, clearly unsure whether interrupting mattered more than the growing line of customers. Charlotte surprised herself by answering first. Give him 10 minutes. The manager blinked. Yes, ma'am. He hurried away immediately. Marcus looked at her with quiet surprise. You did not have to do that. Charlotte folded her arms slowly. Neither did you when you fixed my brakes after I insulted you. The sentence settled between them unexpectedly soft. Marcus looked away first. Not out of weakness. More like a man unused to hearing accountability spoken plainly from powerful people. Then Ella tugged lightly on Charlotte's sleeve. Miss Charlotte. Charlotte looked down, startled by the small voice. Ella held out a crayon drawing shyly. It showed Marcus standing beside an older black man near a garage. But this time another figure stood beside them. A white man with silver hair smiling broadly beneath a sign that read Whitmore Fleet Services. Grandpa said good people should not disappear just because rich people stop saying their names, Ella said softly. Charlotte felt something tighten painfully in her chest again. Because children sometimes repeated truths adults spent entire companies trying to bury. Then Marcus finally picked up the toolbox and headed toward Bay 3 without another word. But before he disappeared beneath the lifted truck waiting for repairs, Charlotte noticed something she had missed until now. Attached inside the toolbox lid beneath old receipts and oil-stained notes sat a small photograph corner holding an empty space. Like another picture used to be there once. And whatever photograph was missing suddenly felt more important than every document she had uncovered so far. Charlotte could not stop thinking about the empty photograph corner inside Marcus's toolbox. All afternoon it stayed in the back of her mind while executives called, managers hovered nervously around her, and customers drifted through the dealership showroom beneath polished lights and expensive banners. Normally she thrived inside controlled environments like this. Numbers. Strategy. Predictability. But Marcus Reed had quietly shattered something she depended on. Certainty. Around noon, she found herself standing near Bay 3 again watching Marcus work beneath a lifted pickup truck. The sounds around him blended into a rhythm he understood completely. Ratchets clicking. Air hoses hissing. Country music playing faintly through an old radio near the tool cabinets. Marcus moved with the calm precision of a man who trusted skill more than recognition. Sweat darkened the collar of his gray work shirt while grease streaked his forearms, but his focus never broke. Charlotte noticed how customers responded to him too. A nervous older woman arrived complaining about a grinding noise in her brakes. Marcus walked her through the issue patiently without once talking down to her. A young mechanic struggled with a jammed impact wrench, and Marcus fixed it in 10 seconds before returning quietly to work. No showing off. No lectures. Just steady competence. The kind built over decades. Then a black luxury sedan rolled sharply into the service lane. Two men in expensive suits stepped out carrying tablets and tense expressions. Charlotte recognized them instantly. Corporate legal. Neither man looked pleased to see her standing beside the mechanic bays. Miss Whitmore, the taller one said carefully, lowering his voice. We need to discuss the archive request you filed this morning. Marcus glanced up briefly from beneath the truck before returning to work. But Charlotte noticed the slight pause in his movements. He was listening. Now is not the time, she answered coolly. Actually, the lawyer continued, it is exactly the time. Certain records tied to Whitmore Fleet Services are sensitive. Charlotte folded her arms slowly. Sensitive to who? The second lawyer stepped closer. There are liability concerns involving former employees. Former employees. The phrase sounded clinical. Bloodless. Charlotte suddenly hated it. Marcus slid out from beneath the truck then, wiping his hands calmly on the oil rag hanging from his back pocket. You gentlemen need this bay? He asked politely. The taller lawyer looked him over dismissively before recognizing the name stitched above Marcus's pocket. Reed. A flicker crossed his face immediately. Tiny. But there. Charlotte caught it. So did Marcus. Something felt wrong again. The taller lawyer adjusted his tie. No issue here, he said quickly. Too quickly. Marcus nodded once. Good. Then he returned beneath the truck without another word, but Charlotte noticed his jaw tighten slightly this time. The lawyers waited until the sound of tools resumed overhead before speaking lower. Miss Whitmore, digging through old allegations connected to Daniel Reed is not advisable. Charlotte stared at him coldly now. Why? The man hesitated. Because the situation was resolved years ago. Charlotte glanced toward Marcus working silently beneath the truck. Resolved for who? Neither lawyer answered immediately. That silence told her more than any report had. Then Ella appeared near the break room doorway carrying a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in napkins. Daddy, she called softly, you forgot lunch again. Marcus rolled out from beneath the truck and smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at his face. I was wondering where my supervisor went. Ella grinned proudly and handed him the sandwich. The entire moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. But Charlotte saw the lawyers watching it too. Watching a black father covered in grease kneel slightly so his daughter could straighten the collar on his work shirt with tiny careful fingers. Watching dignity exist without money attached to it. One of the lawyers looked uncomfortable suddenly. Marcus noticed them staring and stood back up slowly. Everything all right over there? He asked calmly. The taller lawyer cleared his throat immediately. Fine. Marcus nodded once. Good. Then he unwrapped the sandwich and thanked Ella like she had handed him something priceless. Charlotte watched the lawyers exchange another nervous look before one of them lowered his voice toward her again. Miss Whitmore, he murmured carefully, there are people above us who do not want this story reopened. Charlotte's eyes shifted back toward Marcus Reed standing beneath fluorescent lights eating lunch beside his daughter with grease still on his hands. And for the first time, she realized powerful people were not afraid of what Daniel Reed had done. They were afraid of what he had refused to do. The rest of the afternoon moved differently after the lawyers left. Charlotte could feel it in the dealership. Employees spoke quieter when they passed Marcus's bay. Managers suddenly avoided looking directly at him. Even the legal team disappeared faster than expected once they realized she was not backing down. Marcus noticed all of it too. Years of surviving inside other people's discomfort had trained him to recognize shifts in the air before words arrived. But he kept working anyway. Steady. Focused. Like a man who understood that responsibility did not pause for emotional storms. Around 4:30, Ella sat cross-legged near the parts counter finishing homework while Marcus replaced a transmission line beneath another SUV. Charlotte remained nearby longer than she planned again. Not speaking much. Just watching. At some point she realized she was no longer studying Marcus because of the past. She was studying him because she did not understand how someone could carry so much disappointment without becoming cruel. Then the dealership owner arrived unexpectedly. Richard Coleman stepped out of a silver sedan wearing a navy suit worth more than most mechanics made in 2 months. Mid-50s. Confident smile. The kind of man who treated charm like another business tool. He greeted Charlotte warmly before noticing Marcus beneath the lifted vehicle. The smile faded slightly. "Reed still works here?" he asked casually. Too casually. Charlotte caught it immediately. Why would he not? Coleman adjusted his cufflinks. No reason. Just thought the history might make things uncomfortable. Marcus slid out slowly from beneath the SUV, wiping his hands on the oil rag again. "Afternoon, Mr. Coleman." Calm. Respectful. Coleman barely nodded back. "Marcus." Charlotte watched the exchange carefully now. There was tension here, older than today. Older than Whitmore Fleet maybe. "You know each other?" she asked. Coleman answered too quickly. "Everybody in this business knows everybody." Marcus stayed quiet. That silence said more than argument would have. Then Ella walked over carrying her math worksheet. "Daddy, I got all the fractions right." Marcus's face softened instantly despite the grease streaked across his cheek. "Let me see." He crouched beside her without hesitation right there on the concrete floor while customers moved through the showroom nearby. "You even simplified them correctly." Ella grinned proudly. "Mrs. Harper said fractions are just numbers learning how to share." Marcus laughed softly under his breath. "Smart teacher." Charlotte noticed something strange happen then. Coleman looked uncomfortable watching them. Not annoyed. Uneasy. Like the sight of Marcus Reed being respected by his daughter somehow disrupted something he preferred fixed in place. "Marcus," Coleman said suddenly, "why do not you finish up early today?" Marcus stood slowly again. "Still got 2 jobs left. They can wait until tomorrow." Marcus glanced toward Charlotte instinctively before answering. "Customers already paid deposits." Coleman's jaw tightened faintly. "I am sure they will survive one night." But Marcus shook his head once. "I gave my word they would be done today." The sentence landed quietly but firmly. Charlotte saw Coleman study Marcus differently after that. Like he was remembering something he had hoped time erased. Then Charlotte noticed it. The momentary flicker in Coleman's eyes when he looked at the old toolbox beside Marcus's station. Recognition. Real recognition. Something felt wrong again. Charlotte stepped closer carefully. "You worked with Daniel Reed too, did not you?" Coleman froze almost invisibly. Marcus noticed it immediately. So did Charlotte. "Long time ago," Coleman answered flatly. Marcus folded the oil rag slowly between his hands. "My father used to mention your name." Coleman forced a thin smile. "Hopefully something good." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "He said you were the last man to walk out of the office before the records disappeared." Silence swallowed the entire service bay. Even Ella looked up from her worksheet sensing something shift around the adults. Coleman's face changed for just a second before the polished businessman mask returned. But Charlotte saw it. Fear. Small. Fast. Real. Then Coleman reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "Charlotte," he said carefully without looking at Marcus again, "call me before you go digging any deeper into old company graves." He handed her the card and walked away before either of them could answer. Marcus watched the silver sedan disappear from the lot beneath the falling evening light. Then he looked at Charlotte quietly. "That man knows exactly what happened to my father." Even after Richard Coleman disappeared from the dealership lot, the silence he left behind lingered heavily in the service bay. Marcus stood beside the old toolbox with grease-darkened hands resting against the metal edge while Charlotte watched the fading taillights through the glass doors. Outside, evening settled slowly across Atlanta in streaks of amber and gray. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above unfinished repairs and half-open hoods. Ella returned quietly to her math homework near the break room, sensing the adults carried weights children were not meant to hold. Charlotte finally looked back at Marcus. "You were right." Marcus gave a faint tired smile. About which part? Coleman knows something. Marcus nodded once like confirmation no longer surprised him. My father always said men get nervous when truth survives longer than they expected. Charlotte crossed her arms slowly, still holding the lawyer's business card in one hand. Why did your father never expose any of this publicly? Marcus reached into the toolbox and carefully adjusted a loose wrench before answering. Because exposing powerful people costs money. He paused. And because by the end, my father cared more about protecting his family than winning. Charlotte felt that sentence settle somewhere deeper than she wanted to admit. Protecting his family. Marcus had inherited that completely. Every choice he made revolved around keeping Ella safe from burdens she was too young to understand. She looked toward the little girl coloring quietly at the table. Does she know any of this? Marcus followed her gaze immediately. No, will you tell her someday? Marcus thought about that longer than any question she had asked him so far. Maybe when she is old enough to understand that dignity matters more than revenge. The word stayed with Charlotte. Because she realized then that Marcus Reed could have hated people like her. Maybe part of him had every reason to. But instead he chose restraint over bitterness every single day. That kind of strength was rare. Then Marcus surprised her by asking quietly, "Why are you helping me?" Charlotte opened her mouth instinctively, but no polished answer arrived. The truth felt less comfortable than business language. At first, she admitted softly. Curiosity. Marcus nodded like he appreciated honesty more than comfort. Charlotte continued carefully. But now I think somebody in your family was treated unfairly while people in mine stayed quiet. Marcus looked down briefly at the old toolbox. Silence usually protects power better than lies do. Again, no anger. Just truth spoken plainly. Then Ella suddenly looked up from her worksheet. Daddy? Yeah, baby girl. Grandpa Daniel used to say storms tell you which houses were built right. Marcus's expression softened immediately. He did say that. Ella smiled faintly. I think he meant people too. Charlotte felt something tighten painfully in her chest again. Children repeated wisdom adults spent decades complicating. Marcus walked over and kissed the top of Ella's head gently before returning to the service bay. He picked up another wrench and moved toward the unfinished SUV waiting under the lift. Responsibility first. Always. Charlotte watched him work for several quiet minutes before speaking again. There is something else bothering me. Marcus glanced toward her. The missing photograph? He noticed her surprise instantly and gave the faintest hint of amusement. You keep staring at the empty corner inside the toolbox. Charlotte exhaled softly. Who was in the missing picture? Marcus stopped turning the wrench for the first time all evening. Not dramatic. Just still. I do not know anymore. Charlotte frowned slightly. What does that mean? Marcus rested both hands against the tool cart and looked toward the fading daylight outside the garage doors. The photograph disappeared the week my father died. Charlotte felt cold move quietly through her chest. Who took it? Marcus met her eyes evenly beneath the fluorescent lights. That is the question my father stopped asking out loud near the end. Then he reached into the toolbox slowly and pulled out something Charlotte had never seen before. A small brass key attached to an old Whitmore Fleet Services tag. Worn smooth with age. Marcus turned it once in his fingers before looking back at her calmly.